Hi, I'm David Buckel. I'm one of the volunteers here at the Red Hook Community Farm in Brooklyn, New York. Today we're going to talk about how to build a windrow entirely by hand. Here at the farm they call it Big Salad Day because last night several tons of food scraps were delivered from local farmers markets and it all gets tossed together today. Eventually it will turn into rich compost. This is the largest compost program in New York City that is run entirely on sustainable resources, either solar power or human power. It's also an example of a community compost site. City residents generate a lot of material that can be used for valuable compost, and some of that should stay in the community for the benefit of the community. For example, compost can be used to benefit food gardens and street trees. The more people we get involved with making the compost, the more we engage and interest community members in making things better for their community and the environment. One of the goals is to figure out ways to make it easier for volunteers to work at a community compost site like this. Composting is rewarding in so many ways, but it's not easy. It's hard work. There are lots of methods to make things easier for volunteers. There are the usual things like sending an email in advance with helpful info and providing an orientation once the volunteers arrive at the site. But it's also important to adapt to the experience with the volunteers. Here's 3 beginning tips for you. 1, try to have some jobs ready for veteran volunteers who may not want to go through the orientation again. 2, look for some leadership opportunities for those veteran volunteers, because they might find that rewarding, but be prepared. They may just want to be worker bees, and that's okay too. 3, try to remember to let the team know that there's a final step in the process of building a windrow called the seal. And if you don't let them know now, they might think once they've got all the food scraps done, they're all done, and they'll feel a little disappointed. So get their expectations oriented. Before the volunteers show up, assemble the ingredients. If you don't, then some volunteers will stand around waiting for things. If you want a successful volunteer program, you have to watch the volunteers closely to see what's going on. So for example, if you see someone who is standing around or looking confused, then that's the sort of thing that goes on your checklist to try to prevent the next time around. In the meantime, apologize so they know it's not about them, it's about you. Having the footprint already in place for the windrow is also helpful for orienting the volunteers to their workspace, either wood chips or unsifted compost about 4 inches high. As you know, the ingredients for building a windrow fall into 2 basic categories. Number 1, carbon-based materials like leaves, wood chips, wood shavings, and hay. We call them browns. Number 2, nitrogen-based material like food scraps. We call them greens. The recipe varies depending on what type of compost you want, and at this site, the proportion of greens to browns is roughly 50-50. For more on the science behind the ingredients, check out the link we give you at the end of the video. At this site, some of the greens arrive from local farmers markets in these black bins. So here's an example of how to avoid volunteers standing around and waiting. Pick a team that constantly brings over the bins. Although make sure you offer to have them trade places at some point so they have a chance to do something different. In addition, choose a set number of bins to bring over at each round to line up for tipping into the windrow, which will allow the volunteers to get into a consistent routine. Once in a while, you might do things for the sake of the volunteers that aren't necessarily the best practice, as long as you can later restore the best practice. For example, the best practice is to blend the browns and the greens on the side of the windrow and then toss them onto the mound. That way you preserve the air pockets needed for making good compost. But for a big windrow like this, you may have to tip the bins directly onto the mound at the beginning of the process, even though that crushes some of the air pockets. Otherwise, the work session may be too long and volunteers will start to get discouraged or leave before you are done. So how do you fix things here to make sure you get back to the best practice? Well, at this site, they know that in a couple days they can have another team of volunteers come in and turn the windrow and put those air pockets back in place. On the other hand, if an extra large group of volunteers shows up for a big salad day like this one, then the leader might decide to blend all materials to the side for the entire build of the Windrow mound. That serves two purposes. First, it's a better way to process, and second, the extra work turns into a positive rather than a negative because there are more people to keep busy. Being flexible up to the last minute is part of the art of composting by hand and putting a priority on people. Generally, every site is different in their approaches because volunteers at each site are different in how long they like to work and how often they can show up. So it's important not to assume one approach fits all, but instead to be thoughtful about what seems to work best for volunteers at a particular site. On some things, though, we can't cut corners because it is too hard to fix. So it's important for every whole vegetable or fruit to have at least one slice so the compost process can start. And it's important to pull out any inorganics like bands or plastic bags. Here the leader has a small team split off from the main group to get wood chips needed for the recipe. They use the food scrap bins to carry the wood chips because the wood chips help clean out those bins. Because the bins are being tipped directly onto the windrow for now, the browns and the greens have to go onto the mound in alternating layers. Find ways to let everyone know that it's time for a new layer so they're ready to move forward in a routine. So for example, you might call out, "Ready for greens." After adding a layer of browns and greens, the last two layers are blended while on the mound. This process of adding layers and blending gets repeated over and over again. Once the layers have all been added, the windrow will have to be sealed up to keep warmth in and rodents out. Here they planned ahead for the right moment to split off a couple team members who start pulling that seal material into wheelbarrows. And that way, when the time comes, volunteers aren't standing around waiting for that material. As you watch your volunteers work, you keep making adjustments to suit them as best you can. You may start by having the volunteers tip the bins directly into the mound, but at some point the mound is so high that some volunteers are struggling to get the bins up high enough. So again, you have to be flexible to foster a successful volunteer program. And that means you change the process so volunteers are blending from the side. Keep track of when the ingredients are running low, because at some point you will start having the volunteers use the remaining material to create a narrow ridge at the top of the windrow. That ridge helps promote the composting process because it creates a chimney effect for airflow. Once all the ingredients are in the windrow mound, it is time to tuck everything in with brooms and the flat side of rakes. Take a moment to admire the windrow the volunteers have created, remind them of the next steps, let them know that a break is on the way, and emphasize the importance of sweeping the surface clean. More than any other step in the process, this is the one that helps control rodents like rats, so the volunteers need the information to know why this step cannot be a sloppy one. Bits of food roll far and wide, or drop from the shovels and the pitchforks that are left off to the side, so volunteers may have to start sweeping up to 20 feet out from the windrow. A zigzag motion is more effective because the broom comes at food bits from two different directions. After the sweep up is all done, is a good time for a break because it's a moment of accomplishment and the windrow is a pretty thing to look at. This is a time when you can mention how much material the volunteers have diverted from landfill and answer questions the volunteers may have. The last step is the seal, to keep warmth in and rats or birds out. Here the choice is to use more developed compost for the seal. To ensure a uniform depth for the seal, the work starts at the bottom and proceeds up, similar to bricklaying or building an igloo. This windrow was built entirely by hand. The volunteers got great exercise while helping to build community and improve the environment. So that's how we do a big salad here at the Red Hook Community Farm. The focus is on people and trying to make adjustments as often as we can so it's easier for the volunteers to do the work and enjoy it, while at the same time making really good compost for the community. What we're going to do now is put up on the screen a web link for you as a launch pad to other resources.